The Jewel Thief, Ranch City Academy Book 2, by Andrea Pearson. Copyright 2015, Andrea Pearson. Dedication. To Lacey, Sophie, and Liam. We love you. Carter slammed his locker door shut and glanced up in time to see Ridge, his former best friend, staring at him. Carter glanced away. It hadn't taken long for Ridge to replace him with a new best friend, a girl who was probably willing to break all sorts of laws. She was there now, laughing at something Ridge had said. From the way her gaze flitted to Carter before she busted up, they were probably talking about him. Wonderful. Carter passed Ridge in the hallway, heading to his first class. He pretended not to notice the two of them. Luckily, he and Ridge only had one class together this semester, science. Unluckily, that was the class he was headed to now. Due to seating arrangements, they were still sharing a table. Carter was grateful they weren't lab partners, but he really wasn't in the mood for Ridge's gloating and annoying behavior today. "How's it going?" Ridge asked as he slid into his chair. "Great." Ridge waited for Carter to ask how he was doing, but Carter turned his attention to the front of the class and the lesson that was about to start. He soon noticed that Ridge was antsy today. He stared at the clock a lot, tapping his foot and clicking the tips of his fingers on the table. More than once, his pen ended up in his mouth, and he chewed on it ferociously. Gross. Carter frowned. Ridge was up to something. He wasn't normally this nervous. Was he cheating again, and if so, on what? They didn't have any big assignments in science. Besides, Ridge cheated frequently and was smooth about it. Nonchalant was the word Carter's mom had used. Maybe he had to go to the bathroom. Another student was out using the hall pass, so perhaps that was it. When the pass returned, though, Ridge didn't ask for it. What else could it be? And why was Carter so worried about Ridge's nervousness? It wasn't his business anymore, not since their friendship had ended. Then another reason for Ridge's behavior occurred to Carter, and he felt the blood drain from his face. Ridge was going to bring someone back to life. Fantastic. The month before, Ridge and Carter had discovered a recipe in a book of spells that taught them how to temporarily raise someone from the dead. They'd done it once, but had been asked not to perform the spell again by the guy who owned the book. But Ridge wasn't one to keep a promise, especially when his fingers were crossed while he made it. Science ended, and Carter barely noticed. He wished he could follow Ridge, but knew he'd just get in trouble if he did. He couldn't afford to miss his classes. Carter spent the rest of the day trying to focus, but was completely unable to do so. He didn't see Ridge anywhere, even near their lockers, for the rest of the day. Had Ridge skipped his classes? But why show up at all, if he was planning on bringing someone back to life? By the time the last period had finally arrived, Carter's stomach was in knots. He entered the classroom and slumped into his seat, surprised to see that their usual teacher wasn't there. Carter couldn't remember a time when Mr. Johnston had missed. Maybe he was sick. Instead of Mr. Johnston, a woman in clothes that obviously weren't meant for her stood at the front of the room. She wore basketball shorts and a very large man's shirt. She had a black tennis shoe on one foot and a dressy pink high heel on the other. No socks. Her hair was pulled up on top of her head in a big bun. Her arms were crossed in front of her, and she held a marker in one hand and a ruler in the other. The expression on her face was somewhat unpleasant, even though she looked like she was trying to smile. What was she planning on doing with the ruler? Whack some kid's hand with it? The woman cringed when the bell rang, glaring up at it. She then turned to the class and introduced herself. At least, Carter thought that was what she was doing. Her accent was way too thick to understand what she was saying, and a quick glance around the room showed that the other students couldn't understand either. The woman got frustrated when she realized she wasn't getting through. She turned and instead wrote her name on the board. Sonia Bluvstein. Where in the world did that name come from? Sonia tried to ask them to do something, but all she got in response were blank stares. She grumbled in frustration, then turned to the board and wrote other things down. But even her handwriting was nearly impossible to read. Carter narrowed his eyes as he realized what was going on. This was the person Ridge had brought back to life. She obviously didn't belong here. She couldn't speak English, those definitely weren't her clothes, and she wasn't comfortable with the things in the classroom that any teacher, even a substitute, should be familiar with. Like the smart board. She wrote on it with a marker, then was frustrated it wouldn't erase. She struggled with remotes and the computer, and ended up tossing the mouse across the room in frustration. Carter couldn't help but snicker when the phone rang, and she practically jumped out of her skin. Sonia looked around, panicking, when the kids laughed. Carter rolled his eyes but took pity on her and answered the call. He hung up after getting the message, glancing at the wanted student. "Jace, go to the main office." "Okay," Jace said. Carter returned to his seat as Jace left, and Sonia sent Carter a grateful expression. Carter smiled in response, but felt a bit of a chill crawl down his back. There was no way Ridge would bring back someone who was good. All of the people he'd suggested the month before had been evil, murderers, thieves, people like that. A sudden banging on a box in the corner of the room made everyone jump. Sonia flushed, mumbling something that sounded like an apology. The box bounced to the side. The class jumped again. Sonia yelled at the thing, and it stopped moving. But it didn't stay that way for long, and pretty soon, everyone was distracted by the constant shuffling sounds coming from that corner. Sonia must have realized this was a great way to keep the kids entertained, because she retrieved the box, a smile on her face, and made hand movements that showed she was wondering if the students wanted her to open it. Yes. Several kids cheered while many others screamed no. Sonia grinned and opened the box. A monkey jumped out. Carter felt his jaw drop. Where did this lady get a monkey from? The creature was tiny and cute. It was wearing a little blue button-up shirt and a blue cap that was strapped to its head. The monkey jabbered at the students, and Sonia smiled, a relieved expression crossing her face. She let the students take turns holding the monkey, or, as was mostly the case, she let the students take turns having the monkey climb all over them. The rest of the time flew by, as the monkey entertained everyone. Carter didn't mind, but he was still suspicious. Why would Ridge have a dead person come to school? What could he possibly gain? Was Ridge going to have the woman try to change his grades? That didn't seem likely. She obviously didn't know anything about technology, and her English was awful. And what had happened with Mr. Johnston? The bell rang, and the little monkey jumped up on Sonia's shoulder, waving bye to the students as they jabbered excitedly on their way out of the room. Carter also left, wondering what he should do next. Follow the woman? Yes, that's what he would do. He left his classroom and stood in the hall near the water fountain to wait. As Sonia walked out, he got a drink, watching her from the corner of his eye. Then, wiping his face, he followed her toward the front of the school. Sonia paused near the main office, seeming way more interested in that place than she probably should have been. Carter shook his head in frustration. What was she doing? Finally, the woman exited the building and walked to Ridge's dad, Stephen, and his truck. Stephen opened the door for her, and Carter could see Ridge already inside. They drove off, leaving a confused Carter behind. He'd missed the bus but didn't mind the walk, he needed to think. The first thing Carter did when he got home was get a snack. The second thing he did was hop on the family computer and search YouTube, trying to figure out where Sonia's accent was from. He spent over an hour listening to people from various countries talk. He was first able to mark Spanish and German off the list, with French, English, and Italian soon following. He didn't think she had an Asian accent, so didn't even go that way. The moment he heard a Russian accent, he knew that was where she was from. Now that he'd narrowed in on her accent, he started searching the internet for Sonia, Russia. That brought up information about a hotel, and lots of websites on the meaning of the name Sonia. Not very helpful. What was her last name? The only thing he could remember was that it started with a B. Oh, she also had a monkey. He'd better add both of those to his searches. Sonia B. Russia monkey. Yet again, he didn't find anything helpful. He needed to remember what her last name was. Carter leaned forward, eyes closed, envisioning her writing her name on the board. He pressed his hands into his eyes, trying to force them to bring up what they'd seen earlier. It was a weird name. Blove something. Was Blove enough? Sonia Blove, Russia Monkey, brought up a Wikipedia page on a woman named Sonia Goldenhand. Carter clicked on that. The first thing he saw was a picture of the woman who had been substituting in class that day. He leaned back in his chair, relieved to have finally found her. Sonia Goldenhand wasn't her real name, it was a nickname. How had she gotten it? He quickly scanned the article. She'd earned it by stealing lots and lots of jewelry. So it seemed as if Ridge planned to steal something, probably something small and expensive. But from whom? And again, why would he have her come to school? The next day, Carter swung past English on his way to science. Sonia was still there. That meant she hadn't yet stolen whatever it was she was there to take. Carter breathed a sigh of relief. He still had time to stop her. Throughout the day, he made a point of checking on her frequently. And it became apparent that she was making a point of checking on the main office frequently. So, whatever she was planning to steal was there. But what could it be? During lunch, Carter decided to check the place out. He looked around, trying to act casual, but of course Mrs. Porter, the principal, caught him. "Carter, what can I do for you?" He opened and closed his mouth, trying to come up with an excuse. "I was, wondering if my mom called for me." Mrs. Porter shook her head. "I don't think so. We would have asked you to come to the office if she had, but I'll check anyway." Carter thanked her, then peeked through the door to her office while she was gone. A stapler was on the desk, along with a laptop and cell phone. If Ridge wanted to steal technology, there were easier places to go about doing so. The only other thing he saw was the doll she kept in a glass case in the corner. According to Mrs. Porter, the doll wore a traditional wedding dress and jewelry from the 1700s. The glass was to keep the dust off of it, not to keep it secure, and Mrs. Porter had always made it clear that the jewelry the doll wore was fake. It was big and gaudy. Carter and the other students had no problem believing her story. Carter hesitated. But Ridge probably wouldn't know. He was new, had only been going to the school for about a year. Carter did a facepalm. If this was what Ridge was after, he'd brought someone back from the dead to steal fake jewelry. The idiot. Just then, Mrs. Porter returned. Had she noticed him staring into her office? If so, she didn't let on. "Nope, nothing for you. Are you expecting something? Is it important?" Carter shook his head. "No. I'm positive my mom will make sure you guys call me if she needs something." Mrs. Porter nodded, then returned to her office, instructing him to get back to lunch. He did so immediately, glad that she didn't seem to suspect him of anything. That evening, Carter knocked on the door to his mom's study. She looked up and saw him. "You know you don't need to knock when it's open." Carter hovered by the doorway. "I know." She waited for a moment, then said, "Well." His face heated up, indicating that he was blushing. "Great." Mom stared at him for a moment before shutting her laptop. "Sit down. What's going on?" He bit his lips, wondering what he should and shouldn't say. What do you do when you know someone is going to steal something? When you know it's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet? Carter nodded. Well, it gets tricky when the person hasn't done anything. You could warn the victim that you think something will happen. Her eyebrows drew together. Is Ridge doing the stealing? Carter looked at his shoes. He tried to think of something to say to lead his mom off the case, but realized she was smart enough to know that was what he was doing. Mom sighed. I'm glad you're not playing with him anymore. So, what do I do? She got up and sat next to him. Well, first, be very cautious. Don't accuse before anything has happened. Keep your eyes open without getting involved. And like I said, warn the person who might get robbed. She bit her lower lip. But you have to be careful with that one. You don't want them to suspect that you're a part of it. Mom glanced at him from the corner of her eye. Which you aren't, right? He shook his head. You know me. I do, and I'm grateful you're not like that. She put her arm around him. Just be careful. I don't want you getting mixed up in anything bad, even if you're taking no part in it. Sonia was still there the next day. Carter saw her waiting around by the principal's office, so once again, Carter stopped there during lunch. This time, though, he went straight to Mrs. Porter's office and knocked on the door. She opened up, surprised to see him. Come on in, have a seat. Carter plopped himself in a chair and took a deep breath. Before she could ask him what he needed, he blurted out, Do you have anything valuable in here? Because I think one of the other students is planning on stealing something from you, and if you have anything valuable, you might want to hide it. Mrs. Porter's eyes widened. She blinked. How do you know this? Carter was expecting her to ask, but still, his hands started sweating. I can't say anything, because I don't want to get them in trouble before they've done anything wrong. But I know someone who isn't a very good person, and they've been spending a lot of time around the office lately. So have you, Carter. Carter nodded. I wasn't sure what they were planning on doing, but you have to listen to me. I have a bad feeling that something is going to happen, so if you do have valuable stuff, hide it. Thank you for the warning, Carter. I certainly hope you're wrong, but I'll do a sweep of my things here and check anyway. That would have to do. He hoped she would take him seriously. The rest of the day went smoothly enough, and when Carter got home, he told his mom about his conversation with Mrs. Porter. You've done your best. You can't worry about it anymore. She's been warned, it's in her hands now. Carter knew his mom was right, but still, he stressed. He went to his room and sat on his bed, staring at his cell phone. He needed to let Ridge know he was on to him. But how? And would it just make Ridge mad? He'd probably retaliate, especially if he was stopped somehow. Carter dialed the number, his hands shaking. Hey Carter. Change your mind about hanging out with me? No. He closed his eyes for a moment. Listen, Ridge. I know you're up to something. Ridge laughed. I'm not up to anything. Sonia Golden Hand. Whatever, it's still you in charge. You could help, you know. Carter froze. Ridge really didn't know him if he thought that would ever happen. I take it from your silence you're not interested. Definitely not. Ridge blew out a breath, making an annoying fuzzy sound in Carter's ear. Can't blame me for trying. You were always way too good. Carter rolled his eyes and ended the call. He didn't need to put up with Ridge's stupid attitude. He dropped the phone on his bed, leaving the room. It was time for dinner anyway. Carter hopped on the bus and took a seat in the middle, where he always sat. Ridge was in the back, laughing loudly with that girl. It felt like someone was sticking wet fingers in Carter's ear and made him cringe. He wished he could erase the sound of Ridge's stupid laugh from his brain, but it seemed to follow him throughout all of his classes that day. Halfway through English, he realized he couldn't stop Ridge. And there was no way he'd be able to stop Sonia either. She was a professional thief and an adult. Carter was going to need help. Adult help. He could go to the police, but like his mom said, until the crime had been committed, there was nothing they could do. Carter groaned, dropping his head to the desk, ignoring the laughter of the students around him as the monkey did yet another silly trick. He was going to have to perform the spell. Carter skipped the bus again on his way home. He didn't have any time to spare, and hoped he wasn't too late. Sonia had been acting weird, and Ridge had actually stopped by the classroom after school on his way to his dad's truck. They were probably going to try to pull off the heist in the next day or two, possibly even tonight. Carter stopped by the local second-hand store and bought a big pot with the rest of that week's lunch money. He couldn't use his mom's pan again. She'd been understandably upset last time. He then walked home, wishing he had a smartphone and could look up dead detectives while walking. But he at least had a plan for when he got to the computer. The detective needed to be the best. He or she needed to be one person, not a group of people. And he or she needed to be able to work quickly. Carter searched for famous detectives. After half an hour of reading, he picked one with promise. This guy would be perfect. He was always right. He understood how villains thought, due to the fact that he'd been a criminal before becoming a detective, and the cops kept going back to him, even though they didn't trust him. He produced results. In fact, he invented the title of private detective. His name was Eugene Francois Vidocq. Carter had no idea how to pronounce most of that. He really hoped he and the guy would be able to communicate, because he doubted Eugene spoke English. Carter grabbed an egg and kerosene from his dad's office. Then, with the items tucked under a blanket, he slipped out of the house and dashed to the forest down the street. It took him a moment to remember how the recipe was supposed to be performed. Something about mixing dirt and water together, then putting the egg in the bottom of the pan. Carter did so, remembering how the rest went as he worked. He would also need to create a small divot in the mud on top and pour some of the oil in it. Once everything was ready, Carter held his hand over the pot and, hoping pronunciation didn't matter, whispered the words, "Donne solun oui Eugene Francois Vidocq." Even though he knew to expect it, the magical pull on his hand still made him jump. His fingers tickled, and the oil poofed into flames. Pretty soon, the entire mound was engulfed in fire, and Carter watched as the mud molded around the egg, forming a flaming mud ball. It cracked a little as the flames died out, and the water evaporated. Carter draped the blanket over the pan. He wished he had a trusted friend, especially since it would now take 24 hours for the spell to complete. He couldn't stay in the forest that whole time, but he would have felt so much better knowing another person was standing guard when he couldn't be there. After making sure the pan was hidden where only he would be able to find it again, Carter headed home. The next day at school, Ridge was extra nervous. So was Carter, but luckily, Ridge didn't notice. Ridge's nervousness gave Carter a bit of relief, though. It meant Sonia still hadn't stolen whatever she was after. The fact that the school went about as normal, with Mrs. Porter just as chipper as usual, also said the act still hadn't been committed. But judging by Ridge's fidgeting, it had to be happening that evening. Time seemed to crawl by, and Carter couldn't help but glance at the clock every 5 minutes. What would happen if Eugene came to life before Carter returned? Would he wait there, or would he wander off? Was there something in the spell that said they had to stay put, or did it depend on their personality? Finally, the last bell rang, and Carter bolted from his seat. Sonia was packing everything up that she'd gathered throughout the week. Carter was positive some of the things she was collecting weren't hers, and put them in the monkey's box, obviously getting ready to leave forever. The monkey ran around the room, stuffing things in its mouth. Carter took the bus home, then rushed straight to the forest. The pan was where he'd left it, blankets still draped over it. He looked at his watch. 2 hours to go. Instead of hanging out by the pan, he decided he needed to check in at home, eat a snack, then return with some homework. Hopefully his mom wouldn't ask where he was going, because he didn't want to lie. Luckily, she was on the phone with Grandma, so Carter was able to slip out of the house unnoticed. He settled in near the thicket where he'd hidden the pan, then tried to do his math homework. He couldn't concentrate, though. Instead, he ended up playing games on his phone. The alarm on his watch went off, and moments later, the blanket was thrust out of the brambles. A man followed on hands and knees, a cranky expression on his portly face. He got to his feet and wiped dirt from his clothing. Eugene scratched his head, mumbling to himself, and looked around. His eyebrows were drawn tightly together until he spotted Carter. Then his face relaxed. "Ah, Carter. There you are. What can I do for you?" Carter understood the words but could tell they weren't in English. His brain, or the magic, took them and translated them for him. That was pretty cool. He knew from experience that the person brought back from the dead would know the name of the individual who did the spell. They'd also be unable to do anything beyond the purpose for their resurrection, so Carter had to make sure he was specific and thorough. A woman is about to steal something from my school. I need you to stop her, and if that isn't possible, I need you to find anything she ends up stealing and give it to me. Carter would then return the items himself. He didn't want people asking questions about Eugene. Eugene nodded. Do you know what is to be stolen? Some jewelry, I believe. And who is performing the evil deed? A woman named Sonia Golden Hand. She was born a few years before your death. Eugene again nodded. Tell me about this woman. Carter filled in the older man on everything he knew about Sonia. Then he told about Ridge, since Ridge was the one calling the shots. He also told Eugene about the doll in the school, and the jewelry that he was positive would be taken. So, you first need me to stop this woman, then if that doesn't work, retrieve from her the jewelry and return it to you. Carter nodded. Easy enough. When shall we begin? As soon as possible. The school will be closing in about an hour, and it'll take us that long to walk there. Walk? You don't have a carriage to take us? No. And before you ask, I can't drive either. He glanced at Eugene. You might end up having a lot of questions about the world now, and I'll answer them as much as I can before we get there. Eugene held out his hand and helped Carter to his feet. Carter decided to leave the oil, pan, and blanket where they were. He'd take them back home when he returned Eugene to the past. Carter was right. Eugene had tons of questions, especially when he started seeing things that hadn't existed during his lifetime in France. Which was pretty much everything. When they arrived at the school, Carter's voice had nearly left from talking so much. This guy was a lot more inquisitive than the last guy they'd brought to life. The school was closed, and the sun nearly set when they arrived. A brisk wind had picked up, and Carter pulled his hoodie close around himself, grateful it was dark in color. He wouldn't be easily noticeable. Eugene's attitude suddenly changed. Carter was fascinated to see the inquisitive man become the leader, telling Carter what to do. He was in his element. Eugene had Carter show him around the exterior of the school. Carter nearly panicked when they tried every door, and all of them were locked. But then Eugene found a loose window, and with a long stick was able to flip the lock inside. He lifted Carter through, then followed. Are there any contraptions set up which might sound an alarm? Eugene asked, walking across the classroom and poking his head out the door to the hallway. Carter shrugged. I'm not sure, he whispered. Then we must proceed cautiously. The sound of something crashing to the floor echoed down the hall. Sonia. Ridge's voice said. What are you doing? Carter and Eugene looked at each other. No alarms then, Eugene whispered. They would have been triggered by now. If they haven't been already, Carter said. Eugene scowled. Let's go. They scurried down the hall toward the office in time to see Sonia and Ridge dashing through the front doors and out of the school. Shattered glass from the front doors and the main office was everywhere. Mrs. Porter's doll was on the ground, its head broken off and the jewelry missing. Flashing police lights approached. We were too late, Carter exclaimed. And the alarm was triggered. We gotta go. Eugene nodded. They rushed back the way they'd come, Carter's feet throbbing from the long walk he'd just forced them to go through. Hey, someone shouted. Stop. Eugene slammed the classroom door shut behind them and pulled the nearest desk in front of it. Then he lowered Carter through the window, jumping out behind him. The two raced across the lawn, past the soccer fields, and entered the small forest near the school. Cops dashed after them, still shouting. Carter heard one of them calling for backup, his radio crackling in response. The boy and man plunged into the darkness of the trees, running as fast as they could. We can't stay in the forest, Carter said. They'll find us here, it's too small. Where did the woman and boy go? Carter shook his head. Ridge's house, maybe? Then let us doff our outer clothing, separate, and meet there. Good idea, but how are you going to find your way? Carter was huffing now. His chest and side ached, and his feet had to be totally blistered by now. Excellent observation. I'll walk on one side of the road, you the other. Stay out of sight as much as possible. It wasn't a great plan, but they didn't have another. Carter tossed his hoodie into a thicket of bushes, and Eugene put his coat there as well. Then they exited the forest to a suburban street. Carter crossed the road and slowed his pace, shoving his hands in his pockets. He hoped he looked casual enough. It wasn't so late where a boy walking around would catch attention, but it was cold enough where not having a hoodie might. Flashing lights reflected off of the windows on the street, and Carter forced himself to slow even more, trying to catch his breath. A cop car drove up alongside him. Carter looked over and smiled, giving a small wave, hoping it looked natural. He pushed his hand back into his pocket. "Hey kid, where are you heading?" the cop asked. Carter resisted the urge to look across the street for Eugene. He took a breath, stifling the gasp his lungs wanted him to take. He was so out of breath still. "Home. You look cold." Carter shrugged, taking another even breath. "It's okay as long as I keep my hands in my pockets. Have you seen a man and a boy anywhere out here?" Carter looked down the street. "I thought I saw someone running out of the forest." He pointed. "The man headed that way." "Thanks." The cop stared at him for a moment longer, then rolled up his window and pulled the car around. Carter kept walking casually, resisting the urge to look back. He whistled a tune for good measure. The flashing lights and sounds of the car disappeared. Carter exhaled in a rush. They hadn't been caught. At least not this time. He glanced across the street where Eugene was hiding behind some bushes by a house. Eugene waved and Carter continued forward. Half an hour later, they met up at Ridge's house. It was dark, no one was home. "Dang it," Carter said, shoving his hands in his pockets again. Eugene narrowed his eyes, studying the house. "Tell me more about your friend." Carter hopped from foot to foot, trying to stay warm. "He's likable and friendly. Hardly anyone suspects him of doing bad things. My mom figured him out really quickly though. He's good at sneaking around, and he always makes really great plans for pulling off his stupid games." "He's calculating, then?" Carter nodded. "Yes. Very." "Does he possess a great deal of patience?" Carter nodded again. "He's most likely going to have Sonia hide the jewelry somewhere. Based on his personality, he'll wait a long time, perhaps years, before doing anything with the gems. We need to find him as soon as possible." Carter was shocked about Eugene's deductions, before remembering the man had been a criminal before becoming the world's first detective. "Think, Carter. Where would Ridge hide something?" "The forest where I brought you to life," Carter said immediately. "He spends a lot of time there. It fascinates him." "Very well. Let us go now." Eugene eyed Carter. "We need warmer clothing, however." Carter couldn't agree more. "My house is over there," he said, pointing. "I can get you one of my dad's sweaters while I get my coat." Eugene agreed. He waited out of sight while Carter snuck inside and got the clothing. Mom was in her study, Dad cooking dinner, and no one saw Carter. He breathed another sigh of relief, especially when he put the warm coat on. Much better. It didn't take long to walk to the forest. When they got there, Eugene studied the ground for a moment, tapping his cheek. "Can you track them?" Eugene shook his head. "I'm not a hunter or tracker." He looked at Carter. The expression in his eyes was intense as he studied Carter's face. Carter could tell he was thinking. His detective hat was on again. "If I were this particular criminal, where would I go?" Eugene asked himself quietly. He turned from Carter, entering the forest. "We should probably stay out of sight. I'm sure the authorities are still searching for their fugitives." "Good point." Eugene began mumbling, and Carter had to listen hard to understand what he was saying. "We need a place somewhat impassable, but not overly obvious. There's a deserted mine shaft, about half an hour away. Eugene shook his head. Too obvious. That means a cave would also be too obvious, right? Definitely. Think about your friend, he's an intelligent sort. He knows you're on to him, and will do everything he can to keep you from finding the jewels, even above the authorities. Is there somewhere he knows you won't go? Where he would think you wouldn't suspect him of hiding the jewelry? Carter bit his lips. Yes, actually. The old watering hole. I hate that place. There's a ton of mosquitoes and it stinks. Not only that, but people get sick when they swim in the water. It's full of all sorts of bacteria. It's disgusting. He knows I can't stand it there. Perfect. How far is it? About 10 minutes. Lead the way. 8 minutes later, Carter and Eugene slowed as they heard voices arguing ahead of them. They paused near a large tree, peering around it. Sonia and Ridge were there, fighting. Sonia looked haggard. Her hair was falling out of the bun, dark lines under her eyes. Carter remembered that Nikolaus Croft, the first guy they'd brought to life, had said that once the person's reason for being alive was fulfilled, they'd get increasingly exhausted until the person who brought them back returned them. Sonia was obviously tired. But it was also obvious that she didn't want to part with the jewelry. Both she and the monkey were grabbing at the glittering things in Ridge's tightly clenched fists. Let go, Sonia hissed. Carter was surprised they'd even gotten this far. She was talented. Why hadn't she made off with the jewelry ages ago? Then it dawned on Carter. She was being forced by the rules of the spell to obey Ridge. Ridge must have planned all along to hide the jewelry at the watering hole, because now that she'd delivered the loot, her mission was accomplished, and she was free to do what she wanted. Well, somewhat free. They're mine. I brought you back to give them to me. Sonia kneed Ridge in the stomach. He started falling backward, and the jewelry flew out of his hands, splashing in the murky water near him. Ridge landed on his butt in the mud. He yelled at Sonia, lunging to his feet. You've lost them, he screamed. Sonia smirked. Serves you right, you selfish. She wasn't able to finish her sentence before Ridge had his hand over her head and muttered the words of the spell. Sonia dissolved, blending into the mud near the watering hole. Ridge turned to the greasy water, staring into it, fists clenched. He hesitated for several moments before splashing around, bending over, sweeping with his hands. A panicked expression crossed his face. He bit his knuckle for several moments, then smiled and said, "Swimming gear." He turned and hopped out, racing away from the watering hole. Eugene and Carter ducked down as fast as they could. Had Ridge seen them? No, he ran past, heading back toward the houses. They were safe, for the time being. Carter waited for as long as he dared, then turned to Eugene. He'll be back soon. We need to get the jewelry. Eugene gave a short nod. You stay here, and keep a lookout for the boy. I'll search. This is what you brought me back for. But the water, it has a lot of bacteria in it. Eugene waved him off. I don't know what this bacteria is, but it won't hurt me. People get sick all the time. Will it kill me before I accomplish the task? Eugene asked, already entering the water. Carter shook his head. No, it won't. Still, he felt guilty allowing Eugene to do it. Either way, Carter realized Eugene was right. They didn't have a lot of time. It was better for the older man to go into the water than it was for Carter, and if Eugene couldn't find it, Carter could always look himself. He stationed himself close enough to grab the jewels when, if, Eugene found them, but where he could see far enough into the forest to notice when Ridge returned. Eugene submerged himself. He was down long enough where Carter started getting nervous that he would run out of air. Finally, he came back up, spluttering and wiping his face. You weren't being dishonest about the stench. Carter shook his head, accepting the earring Eugene had found. How much more is there? Eugene asked. Another earring, a necklace, and a crown. Eugene didn't respond before turning and disappearing into the water again, the oily surface gently rippling where he'd gone. A moment later, He resurfaced and handed over the other earring. I can see the crown, but it is wedged under a limb. Okay. Carter tried to hold still, to not show how nervous he was. Eugene didn't need the extra pressure. Eugene went under, and Carter glanced back to the forest. How long had Ridge been gone now? Carter should have checked the time when the boy had left. It was at least a 10-minute walk back home. If Ridge knew where all of the swimming stuff was, he'd be back in less than 20 minutes, assuming he didn't run the whole time. Carter didn't want to assume that. Eugene popped up again. Got it. He handed the crown to Carter. Only need to find the necklace. Eugene had turned and was stepping forward to drop down into the water again when he screamed, making Carter jump. What happened? Carter asked. Are you okay? My foot, Eugene moaned. He lifted it from the water. A huge nail was stuck into the bottom of his shoe. Pull it out. Carter felt the blood drain from his face. Are you serious? I can't do it. Hurry. Eugene sat in the mud and lifted his foot. His face was pale, his lips turning blue. He was going into shock, whether from the pain or blood loss, Carter wasn't sure. Carter grabbed the nail and yanked. Nothing happened. So he pulled and tugged, trying to ignore Eugene's moaning, until finally the nail came loose. Eugene cradled his foot. Blood dripped, landing with little splashes in the murky water below. Carter bit his lips. What do we do? Eugene took a breath. You stand guard. Me. I go back in. You can't, you're. Eugene glared at him. I will accomplish my duty, Carter. Do not try to stop me. With that, he dropped into the water once more. Just then, Carter heard Ridge coming through the trees. From the sounds of it, he wasn't close yet, but Carter still felt his heartbeat double in speed. Hurry, Eugene, Carter whispered, knowing the older man wouldn't hear him. Please hurry. He hovered near the edge of the water, standing in the mud. Got it, Eugene said, popping up. Carter grabbed the necklace and rushed from the mud, prepared to race in the opposite direction from Ridge. Carter, Eugene hissed. Carter looked back. He'd been expecting the man to follow, but Eugene hadn't moved an inch. Carter motioned for him to come. I can't. Eugene fainted, falling into the reeds just to the side of the watering hole. Carter gasped. He knew that the moment Ridge entered the water, he would see the man. Ridge was close enough for Carter to hear his loud panting. He'd step into the clearing at any second. Carter didn't have time to run. He didn't have time to help Eugene. Instead, he backed into the forest to the side, then scaled a tree. He clenched the jewelry in his left hand, grateful he'd always been good at climbing, but wishing he'd had time to tuck the jewelry in his pocket. Ridge appeared right when Carter stopped climbing. He dumped equipment onto the ground, then plopped down and started strapping things on: mask, air tank, flippers. Why did he need flippers? The water was only a few feet deep. And where had he gotten the stuff from, anyway? Carter didn't want to know. He had to take care of Eugene. He leaned over, wrapping the arm that held the jewelry around the large branch, holding his other hand over the water. He hoped Ridge's mumblings were loud enough for the boy not to hear Carter whisper the words of the spell. Donne solun oui, Eugene Francois Vidocq. Nothing happened. Carter wasn't close enough. He scooted as quietly as he could, along the branch. Then he whispered the words again, right as Ridge stepped into the water, the flippers nearly tripping him. Eugene dissolved into the mud just as Ridge started searching. Carter slumped over the branch, the wind rushing out of his lungs. That had been so close. Realizing he wouldn't be able to climb down and escape while Ridge was searching, Carter adjusted his position, grateful the branch was extra thick, and tried to get as comfortable as possible. Then he waited. An hour and a half later, when Carter's hands had long since fallen asleep from clenching so tightly to the branch and jewelry, Ridge finally gave up. He threw the oxygen can and goggles onto the side of the watering hole, then slumped down next to them. Carter didn't need to see Ridge's face to know how upset and disappointed he was. If Ridge wasn't such a bad guy, he'd be tempted to go and comfort him. Finally, Ridge was ready to go home. Just as he was leaving, though, Carter's hand spasmed. An earring dropped through his fingers, landing in the water below with a plop. Ridge paused. Carter froze. Ridge turned, eyes narrowed, and stared at the water. Neither boy moved. Carter felt the other earring start to slip. His hand was numb, his fingers permanently curled. He carefully pulled his arm around to the top of the branch. Ridge stared at the water for what felt like an eternity. Then he looked up, right at Carter. Carter expected him to scream, to shout, to throw things. But he didn't do any of that. In fact, his eyes continued searching the branches, roving over Carter several times. Carter didn't breathe. Ridge was looking at him, but his eyes didn't see him. How had he not seen Carter hiding in the trees? Then Carter realized he could see Ridge because of the moonlight, but the leaves that filled the tree helped him blend perfectly into his surroundings. Finally, Ridge turned and left, and Carter pulled his hand to his chest, catching the second earring before it also fell. That had been way too close. Carter waited another 10 minutes just to be sure Ridge really was gone. Then he straightened his exhausted limbs and stuffed the jewelry in the pockets of his coat. He stiffly climbed down the tree and walked to the water where the earring fell. It didn't take him long to find it. He'd make sure to wash up really well when he got home. Not wanting to cross paths with Ridge in case the boy returned, Carter took a different way home. The first thing he did was find his mom. "Goodness, Carter," she said, noticing his muddy shoes and the leaves and twigs in his hair. "Where have you been? I've been worried sick. Cops have been driving the streets with their lights flashing. They're looking for this." He dumped the jewelry on her desk. "Ridge stole it. I got it all back. Would you please help me clean it?" Mom nodded. "Go shower. I'll clean it up while you're gone." Carter thanked her and left. He hopped into the shower, never before so grateful for warm, clean water. The next day was Saturday, and Carter's mom helped him deliver the jewelry to Mrs. Porter's house. Both women were frustrated when Carter refused to tell how he'd found it, but neither pushed him. He voluntarily confessed about Ridge's involvement in the thievery when he realized he'd have to deal with Ridge either way. The boy was smart enough to realize Carter had been involved. Mrs. Porter thanked Carter and said she'd be having a very long conversation with Ridge and his parents. School was canceled Monday due to significant damage to the place. By Tuesday, however, new doors had been installed and everything cleaned up. When Carter saw Ridge, he almost felt bad for the boy. Ridge's eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked completely depressed. He was quiet during science. He probably had spent several hours at the watering hole again, searching for the jewelry. In fact, Carter would be surprised if Ridge didn't go there every day for months before giving up. Ridge didn't say anything about any punishment he'd received, but Carter didn't expect him to. Mr. Johnston returned to school Wednesday. Apparently, he'd had pneumonia the whole time, and Sonia hadn't hurt him at all. Carter was relieved about that. And he was especially relieved that Mrs. Porter's doll and its jewelry, which he learned from the news had actually been real diamonds and gems, never returned to the school. Would you like to gain access to exclusive audiobooks only available to members of Andrea's Readers Group? Click the link in the description to learn more.